On behalf of the focal program on the family, welcome to the side event of the 60th session of the Commission for Social Development. This event is being webcast live on UNTV and streaming on Facebook Live. You are all encouraged to ask questions on the Facebook Live chat box. My name is Zita Mokumane. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. As a demographer, a family scholar, and a migrant myself, the focus of this event is something that is very close to my heart. The event today is convened as part of the preparations for the upcoming 30th anniversary of the International Year of the Family 2024, what we call IAYF plus 30. As you may know, the preparations are focusing on analysis of major trends affecting families worldwide. Last year, we focused on new technologies. This year, we are focusing on migration and urbanization. Broadly speaking, our aim is to analyze recent migration trends and their impact on families. Since the priority theme of the Commission this year is inclusive and resilient recovery from COVID-19 for sustainable livelihoods, well-being and dignity for all, eradicating poverty and hunger in all its forms and dimensions to achieve the 2030 agenda, the event is also to address migration and its role in poverty reduction and its contribution to the achievement of relevant sustainable development goals. I would like to remind everyone that Agenda 2030 features migration under Sustainable Development 10, specifically Target 10.7, which aims to facilitate orderly, safe, regular, and responsible migration and mobility of people, including through the implementation of planned and well-managed migration policies. Some of the other SDG targets note specific types of migration, including labor migration, Target 8.7 and 8.8, international student mobility, Target 4.B, human trafficking, Targets 5.2, 8.7, and 16.2, remittances, Target 10.C, and migration data, Target 17.18. We have two speakers today, and our first keynote speaker is Dr. Bahira Sherif Trust. Dr. Bahira Sherif Trust is a professor and chair of Human Development and Family Sciences at the University of Delaware. She holds a BA in Political Science with a concentration in International Relations from Yale University and a PhD in Cultural Anthropology from the University of Pennsylvania. Her research focuses on globalization, women's employment, and family change in Western and non-Western countries. And she presents regularly on these topics in international forums. Dr. Trust has authored and edited a number of books, including Women, Work, and Globalization, Challenges and Opportunities, which was published by Routledge in 2014. The other book is Globalization, Families, Accelerated Systemic Social Change, published by Springer in 2010, and Cultural Diversity and Families, which was published in 2007 by SAGE. Much of Dr. Trust's scholarship has been informed through participation with a number of international, national, and community-based research projects that focus on diversity, gender, and work, and strengthening and supporting low-income families. Let me also add that Professor Trust is the author of a background paper entitled Migration, Urbanization, and the Family Dimension, which was published by Department of Economic and Social Affairs, DESA, UN, which will be launched later this year. Professor Trust, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the lovely introduction, Zita. And I would like to thank Renata Kazmerska and her team at the Focal Point on the Family for inviting me and for having a discussion about this very important topic. I am now going to share my screen so that you can see my presentation. So I was asked to speak about migration, family life, and the contribution of remittances to poverty reduction. This is a very complex topic. So what I'm going to try to do is give you an overview of what is going on with migration trends, what is going on with remittances, and then how they intersect both with family life and with poverty. I would like to begin with the following quote, which just came out in a brand new World Migration Report. Like many birds, but unlike most other animals, humans are a migratory species. Indeed, migration is as old as humanity itself. A careful examination of virtually any historical era reveals a consistent propensity towards geographic mobility among men and women who are driven to wander by diverse motives, but nearly always with some idea of material improvement. I begin with this statement because I've noticed that in many contemporary discussions, migration is treated as a new phenomenon. It's not. Humans have always migrated. And in fact, I belong to this group. My family migrated to the United States when I was a very little girl. And who would have imagined that one day I would be talking about this topic at the UN? So I'd like to begin with some statistics. Currently, there are about 281 million individuals who are living outside of their native countries. This represents around 3.6% of the global population. So as you can see, even though the number is high, in relation to how many people there are on this earth, which is over 7 billion people, it's actually not very high at all. The United States has the highest number of immigrants, followed by Germany and Saudi Arabia. In terms of sending countries, India, Mexico, and China are right now the major. People leave those countries and go to other parts of the world. Another graph just to show you that actually migration has stayed relatively even in proportion to, again, to the global population. So you can see from 1995 to 2019, it hasn't changed much. Now, the proportion of migrants to the local population is very different in different places. On this graph, you can see the darker colors. That means that there are proportionately more migrants living in those countries. So you can see Canada and Australia, for example, are darker than the United States, even though in terms of numbers, the United States has more immigrants. Also, interestingly enough, migration changes and where people go to changes depending on a variety of conditions that we can talk about later. But most recently, this is from UNDESA 2021, the highest degree of migration has happened in Asia and in Europe. Also, there are differences by gender. So for example, there are many more men who migrate to the Arab states and many more women who migrate to North America and North and Western Europe. This is completely based on labor migration. So men go to the Arab states in order to work in construction, for example, and in America and in Northern Europe, there is a great need for care workers, domestic workers, healthcare workers. And so they attract women from other parts of the world. So who migrates and why? This is again very complex. There are a number of factors that come together that lead to migration. One has to do in the conditions people live in. Are they satisfied with those conditions or not? Are they satisfied for their children or not? For example, my parents made the decision to migrate because they want to give my brother and me a better chance in life. Then there are the opportunities. Where can you migrate to? And we're going to talk more about that because despite media representations of this sort of unchecked migration, it is actually much more difficult to migrate today than 25, 30, and 50 years ago. So the ability of potential migrants to exercise choice, specifically in international migration, is actually very limited and is dependent on their home country, the circumstances they live in, lots of their resources they have. For example, the poorest people often cannot migrate. You need a certain amount of resources in order to get a ticket to go and that sort of thing. This comes together with personal agency, what people want for their lives, for their family lives, for their children. And again, we tend to think of migration as an individual choice. Migration is very closely related to family life. People don't just in general alone make the decision to migrate. I will not migrate to another country without a lot of discussions with my partner, my children, my parents, my extended family. So all these things come together and lead to migration. COVID has had a major impact on migration in terms of decreasing migrations. Of course, we all know that the borders closed and all of a sudden people couldn't go from one place to another. You know, among my colleagues, everybody complains about not being able to travel, but that's hardly a hardship in comparison to so many migrants who either got stranded where they were trying to get home and they couldn't go home. For example, I have several students who were unable to go home, or even more troubling, where people were migrants who had to return very quickly all of a sudden to their home societies, and they were not set up in any form to take care of themselves once they got home. So when we look at the OECD countries, what we find is that just through COVID, my permanent migration decreased by 30% to the lowest level since 2003. The prediction had been that migration was going to keep going up, but that's not what happened at all. Also, in general, there's a worrisome structural downward trend where, for example, a lot of migrants go to the Middle East and specifically to certain Arab countries like Saudi Arabia. And actually, there has been less and less need in those countries for migrants, and COVID has hastened this. And part of the problem is that these countries are going to actually need more high-skilled workers, and they need less workers who work in construction and those kind of businesses. COVID has had another very interesting result, which is that the countries, some of the countries that were most affected by COVID, like the United States and the UK, also have the highest degree of foreign-born doctors and nurses. So we have a situation where we have a high degree of migration from high-skilled workers, but they're the ones on the front lines dealing with the COVID situation and themselves getting COVID because of the work that they are engaged in. I just wanted to add that because I think it's a really hidden piece in this discussion about migration and COVID and what is happening. You know, so we have different types of migrants affected in different ways by the pandemic. Migration has become a very important part of economic agendas of countries. So not just on a personal level. And as Zita mentioned, migration is considered so important that it is one of the targets in the SDGs. And you know, the target 10.7 emphasizes that migration needs to be orderly, safe, and regular. And then there are other targets that also make direct connections to migration, specifically focusing on labor migration, international student mobility, human trafficking, remittances, and the gathering of migration data, something else we can talk about later. The general emphasis of governments is that migration helps with international trade, with diplomacy, forging cultural ties. But in reality, migration actually provides a very high source of foreign income. Much of this income comes through remittances. Remittances are economic transfers that follow unidirectional path. That means they go from one place to another place and sit there, from the migrant to her or his sending family and community. What we often forget is we tend to think of states and borders and people belonging to certain places. But the transfer of remittances actually occurs in this sort of overarching space. It occurs in transnational spaces and this is very complex in terms of the rules that govern all of this sending of money. I wanted to show you this little infographic also because I think it's very, very interesting. So the migrant goes to their new host country, they earn money. And this is just a generalization, but still it helps put things into perspective. They keep 75% of the money for themselves, for what they need. They save about 10% of money, and then they send about 15% of their earnings home. Their family relies on these remittances for up to 60% of their own household expenses. They use it for their immediate needs, and they save 25% of that money. Please remember this statistic because we're going to be coming back to it. So who are the top remittance sending countries and receiving countries? So India, China, Mexico, the Philippines, and Egypt are the countries that receive the most remittances. Remittances, however, are so important at this point in 2022 that they now make up high percentages of the GDPs of a lot of low-income countries. So what this means is that governments are relying on the labor, and not just the labor, but the money, the goodwill of people sending money back to their families. And it has become a very important component of the whole economic pie of a certain number of countries. Let me show you this slide also, which I find incredibly interesting. Look at the yellow line. Look at the 3 lines. This is foreign direct investment, official development assistance to low and middle income countries, and remittances. In 1990, they were all about the same. Look at the one line that has gone up steadily all the way to 2022. That is remittances. So this is, again, individual actions, people sending money to other people who they love, and that has increased beyond all other types of investment. This is probably the most interesting fact out of all. The prediction was that through COVID, the sending of remittances would go down because people were losing their jobs, they didn't have any money, border closures, everything else. But look at what happened. The opposite happened. Remittances to low and middle income countries grew, they were stronger. They reached $589 billion in 2021. So again, these are individual actions. Nobody's forcing these people to send money, and they are sending money on their own and revitalizing, helping the lives of others in their home communities. Different parts of the world were affected differently. So for example, Latin America and Central America, remittances went way up in 2021, more than in any other part of the world. And you see here in, in 2020, they went down and then up they went. So in all regions of the world, migrants stepped up their support to their families back home. And especially they sent money back home to countries where COVID really hit hard. How did they do this? Well, through a variety of mechanisms, but a lot of migrants are in high income countries. And in those countries, there were emergency fiscal stimulus packages, and people benefited from those and they sent money home. The United States plays a very important role in this whole discussion about remittances, because the United States, as I mentioned earlier, is the largest recipient of migrants from developing countries, but it is also the largest source of remittances to other countries. So in 2020, there was a total outflow from the United States of $68 billion to other parts of the world. And you can see it reached basically every other part of the world. And this had to do with government assistance through loans to small and medium businesses, grants to local governments, social benefits, and then migrants also have savings, and they sent these remittances to family and friends in their origin countries. Remittances have become so extremely important that the head of the social protection branch of the World Bank wrote, and I'm going to quote, "Remittance flows from migrants have greatly complemented government cash transfer programs to support families suffering economic hardships during the COVID-19 crisis. Facilitating the flow of remittances to provide relief to strained household budgets should be a key component of government policies to support a global recovery from the pandemic." So these individual actions have become part of a very large, complex economic recovery for the whole world. So as you can see, migration and remittances are very closely tied to families specifically, because people are not sending money to charities necessarily or communities. They are primarily sending money to people who they love. And this has become a major vehicle for helping reduce the scale and severity of poverty, particularly in low and middle income countries. So besides the economic piece of remittances, remittances are also associated with better human development across a number of areas, including households that receive remittances tend to have better health, the children stay in school longer. In some cases, there's higher degrees of gender equality, but I should say in parentheses, not in all cases. In some cases around the world, there's also been a rise in gender violence, unfortunately. So remittances on the whole act as a lifeline for poor families and individuals in other settings. There is more and more research about the impact of remittances. There's some recent studies out of Pakistan and Mexico, and they show that households that receive remittances have lower school dropout rates. And for example, babies tend to have a higher birth weight. I also wanted to show you this, this graph because I think it's very interesting. It is a graph about the status of households in certain sub-Saharan African countries. And what you see, the lightest bar, these are households that received international remittances from outside of Africa. And what you see is that the children tend to stay in school longer and get more education in households that are recipients for remittances. Interestingly enough, what we have learned specifically through COVID, because COVID was a global crisis that affected every country around the world. But what we have learned from this crisis is that unlike other monetary flows, remittances are counter-cyclical. So family members that go abroad are even more motivated to help their family members back home, even if their own financial situation has deteriorated. This is something that nobody expected to happen. And so remittances work as a form of insurance to help families through crisis and also to help them save. For example, there's a recent study from Mali that shows that a substantial part of remittances is saved for unexpected events. And just look who people are sending money to. So primarily migrants send money to their parents. Those are the main recipients of remittances. Then men tend to send money to their spouses. Women sometimes send money to their spouses, not always. They take care of their children, they take care of their siblings, and then other family members. So what we see is that remittance remittances benefit households in every possible way. People get better food, they live in better conditions, they're able to invest in their children, they have better health care, and it works as a type of social security system, private social security system for families. There's a lot of research, a lot of interest in the effect of remittances on poverty. And there is a recent study that shows that, for example, in 71 developing countries, if there were a 10% increase in per capita international remittances, this would produce a 3.5% decline in the share of people living in poverty. I do want to point out that the trends show that remittances reduce the severity of poverty, but not its scale. And I'm going to comment on that again. So not all people who live in poverty have access to remittances. And I think that that's a very important point to remember. Recent research on migration shows that people who live in high-income countries and who are educated have a much higher chance of being able to migrate these days than people who live in poorer countries or who are in poor situation. So again, this goes against sort of the media representation that everybody's migrating. That's actually not true. It is actually much more difficult to migrate today than it was 100 years ago. So the pathways for millions of people in low-income countries, they're not there. They can't migrate, and we need to address this issue. Migrants need protection also, because at times, especially during crisis times, they get exploited, and this needs to be addressed. And as I mentioned before, in many migrant origin communities, they have been hit by a large number of people returning, and they need supports like healthcare, quarantine facilities, and other social services. Another issue I want to touch on is that it is very expensive to send money home. People used to carry money home, or they would send it in the mail. Increasingly, it is done digitally, but the average cost of transferring money is about 6.4%. And in sub-Saharan Africa, it's actually higher. It's around 8%. The SDG target 10C is aiming to get the cost to less than 3%. Again, this is a complex topic. There are many laws in place to avoid money laundering, and that actually affects migrants who are trying to send money home. So again, there's this complexity about who's making the laws and for what reasons. Also, every study shows we need disaggregated data. There are many, many issues about, beginning with even who's counted as a migrant, is it somebody who goes temporarily? Is it somebody who stays permanently? That sort of thing. We need much more information about gender issues, what happens during migration, how people are making their money, how they're sending the money, etc. I want to end with this slide because I feel very strongly about this, is that while it's incredibly impressive to see how individuals have stepped up their support to their families, remittances are not the only solution. They're only part of the solution, because migration involves loss. It involves benefits, but people leave behind. They leave behind their culture. They leave behind their extended families. They have to go to a new place. There are many different types of migration settings. It's very different to go as a laborer where you pay in advance, 20 months of your salary so that you get the access to working in another country, versus if you are a high-paid professional working, for Coca-Cola or something like that. The poorest people around the world do not have access to remittances because, as I said, you need a certain amount of capital to even go, or to send someone in your family. Thus, this is not a substitute for official development aid. Private money cannot fund the public issues that are needed, things like better housing, access to nutrition, all of that. So remittances are not equally accessible to needy populations, and the worst off households lack the capital they need to even engage in migration. So state funds need to target the neediest people that we have. So it's very important to look at remittances and migration as part of the solution, but not the whole solution. And I want to end with a final thought. We look at remittances purely through an economic lens. There are so many reports now by the World Bank and by the United Nations and many other transnational organizations about the economic impact of remittances. But the fact that remittances grew in the way that they did, particularly during a global pandemic, and I'm speaking as an anthropologist, tells us something very different. It tells us about the power of human connection and the fact that we don't, as a human species, we do not leave our loved ones behind. We feel an obligation to them. And in times of great need, we step up to help them. So the Western discourse we have that families don't matter anymore, everybody should just be completely individual and do their own thing. That's actually not what we don't see that in the behavior of people. What we see in the behavior of people is that they care about others. They want to be connected to others. They want to help those that they love. And most importantly, the people they love are the people they have close, in some form, familial relationships to. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Truss, for your presentation. We'll now go to our second presenter for the day, who is Dr. Anu Abraham. Dr. Anu Abraham has a PhD in development economics from Indian Institute of Technology, Madras, India. Her thesis focuses on the interaction between migration and development from a source region perspective within a household economics framework. Her research interests are in the areas of development economics and centers around migration, labor, gender, poverty and inequality, human and social capital, and intergenerational mobility. She has presented her work in many national and international conferences, published in reputed academic journals and newspapers, delivered invited lectures, and also has been part of multi-stakeholder consultation on migration policy in India. She's a recipient of 2 prestigious research fellowships in economics in India. She's currently teaching economics at Narsimorji Institute of Management Studies University in Mumbai and continues her research work on international migration. Dr. Abraham, the floor is yours.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. Thank you, Zita. I would like to also thank Renata and her team for giving me this opportunity to speak. And before I begin, I would also like to say that the flow of my presentation or the conclusions that I'm also trying to draw doesn't differ much from Professor Behera's talk. There are a few introductory slides which are overlapping, which I will skip through. And with that introductory note, I think I'll share my screen. One second. I hope my screen is visible. So before I begin, I think it's important to note here that even I have been a migrant in my life and has had a lot of migrants from my family as well as community, which is probably what drew me to this particular area for my research. So today I will be looking at the impact of international migration and remittances from a source region perspective, the impact on developing countries, I'll be focusing more on household level impacts. So to begin with, as we know, migration is or can be defined very broadly as a movement of a person from his usual place of residence. When they move across an international border, they become an international migrant. Now we know there are migration can be permanent or temporary. Temporary migration has two very significant components associated with it, which is return migration and remittances, both of which are of significant importance, especially in today's time of COVID-19. For example, available data from India, where my research is mostly based on, shows that there has been a large influx of return migrants. And it is something that we need to think about, especially in terms of reintegration, as well as the development potential that return migrants hold, more of which we will look at at a later stage in the presentation. So we know we classify migration as voluntary and forced. Forced being you are pushed out because of adverse conditions, voluntary because you want to voluntarily move to improve your life. But even within voluntary migration, or what we term as voluntary migration, we can say there are aspects of a push factor. Even if you're moving for better jobs or better education, or you're moving with your family, you are at some level pushed to move to something better. So keeping that in mind as well, this presentation will focus on the development impact of international migration and remittances from an origin country perspective, largely looking at existing studies that has come up in this area and comparing the results that have come up on this particular topic. So as Professor Bahira had said in her presentation, currently we have around 281 million migrants. So this graph that I have, this figure that I have here is from 2019. I have still used this earlier figure just to do this comparison from this ILO data regarding the proportion of migrants and migrant workers who constitute a large part of migrants. So migrants constitute around 3.5% of our population. 90% of them are above the age of 15, and 70% of those in this age group are actually migrant workers. So we see that a large proportion of those who are moving are working in the destination, making them labor migrants. Of this labor migrants, we have roughly 60% constituting men and 40% women. Again, probably because of gendered nature of restrictions of mobilities, women might be migrating lesser. Now, looking at this graph, I think I will skip because I think this was dealt with in the previous presentation. It just shows the relevance or importance of remittances in relation to other financial flows into low and middle income countries, how significantly remittances again growing, and it's counter-cyclical in nature, as was discussed. Just to show the increasing trend in remittances coming into low and middle income countries. And this is also countries which are the highest recipients of remittances. We see there are a good concentration of countries in South Asia, and some countries coming from the African region, Southeast Asia, and also we have Mexico and China. And the context of this presentation is within the migration development nexus. So to repeat, we have 281 million migrants who send home around 700 billion USD globally, which is much higher than the official development aid. The importance of migration and development is quite recognized in all international forums, as your 2030 Agenda of Sustainable Development shows. Your target 10.9 10.7, which calls for facilitating orderly migration. SDG target to 8.8, looking at labor migration specifically, and 4.4 education, etc. Now, we know also that the UN has come up with a framework for international cooperation on for migration, the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, which is expressly rooted in the 2030 Agenda, as it explicitly recognizes the importance of effective evidence-based migration policies and practices for optimizing migration's positive developmental outcomes. Now, when we look at the development outcomes or impacts of migration, we can broadly classify them as the macro level outcomes and micro level outcomes. Macro level outcomes mainly dealing with growth, poverty, inequality, while micro level outcomes can be at the individual level, affecting the migrant himself or herself, or a specific member, or the household as a large. Now, this household could be a household which has moved with the migrant, or a household which has been left behind in the source region, to whom the migrant is intimately connected. Now, in this presentation, we'll be focusing mostly on left behind households or members of left behind households, and the different impacts that migration and remittances have for them. We will also look at specific impacts of migration on migrants, either during migration or when they have come back as return migrants. Now, broadly, the views regarding development impacts of migration has been oscillating between optimistic and pessimistic views, but researchers agree that it's way more complex it cannot be contained in a single dimension. And though remittances is considered as the strongest link between migration and development, migration affects the migrants' source region and sending households in many other different ways. For example, we have technology and knowledge transfer, social remittances, including transfer of ideas, cultural norms, lifestyle choices. Now, this is something that so I witnessed, because I come from a part of India which has got a high level of migration to the Gulf Cooperation Council region. So, and there has been many cultural norms that has evolved, many ideas that has been brought. And what is something that has been very interesting, and recently I also read an article on this, is about how food has, the food culture has also been transferred. So food, there has been like networks of language, a lot of different non-tangible, non-monetary transfers also happen. These happen through diaspora networks, interaction with current and return migrants, etc. But while we are talking about transfers, and though benefits of migrations and remittances are very high, we need to also remember that it has its own costs. And we are not just talking about economic costs, but also social cost of migration or psychological cost of migration, and in many other dimensions of costs. Saying that, now I move into the next sections, which look at the different impacts. So the first one that I look at is impacts, macroeconomic impacts. Here I'm just reviewing main literature that has come out on impact of migration on growth, poverty, and inequality. So largely, growth literature says that this literature has, okay, again, the impact of migration has been measured through remittances. So the other impacts of migration, which we were just discussing, is not quite measured, probably because of the intangible nature or lack of available data. Remittances are easier to capture, effects are easier to capture. So most work has come focusing on the impact of remittances. So it aids growth, it reduces growth constraints, improves economic stability, especially because remittances are counter-cyclical. These are the main results. It's positive. The effect of remittance on growth is positive. But then there is also studies which has shown from specific countries that remittances are conducive or supportive of growth if there is a proper financial structure, good political and economic systems, and high social capital. And on the other hand, there are also studies which show that remittance has no impact or stunt growth through something like the Dutch disease. And there is empirical evidence on that side as well. If we look at poverty, again, in poverty, at least the magnitude of poverty is reduced overall when remittance come in. But the results on inequality vary. There is evidence for both increase and decrease. The work that I have done on migration in India, there was seen to be, though remittances relaxed household income constraint, and there was investment, education, etc. in both physical and human capital. What was also seen was that it increased inequality, mainly because the lowest economic strata and the lowest or the most disadvantaged social strata, people were not able to migrate. There was a barrier for migration, especially international migration, and these were also the people who received least amount of remittances. But interestingly, whichever households received remittances, it was these groups that invested most in human capital. That brings us to the next question, whether productive investment or conspicuous consumption. We see, again, evidence for both. There's evidence for investment in productive assets, improved savings in human capital, but there is also evidence of increased consumption now. So again, here also the results are mixed. Looking at evidence on human capital investment. Now, so here we see that remittances tend to encourage households to invest in education. Now, this seems to have a gender dimension, but then it's again not it's not one single result, but studies from different parts of the world show different results, where in some cases girls benefit more, in some cases boys benefit more. Depends also on who has migrated, whether it's a mother, whether it is from a rural area, etc. There are also studies, but then one important aspect that needs to be looked at here is migration and remittances also seem to, especially in highly migrating countries, especially countries where more migration is blue collar migration, children seem to substitute migration for education. And so there is a higher dropout rate, mainly because migration seems to have an incentive in the sense that they have higher returns or earlier returns to from migration than from education. Regarding health, again, expenditure on health increases with remittances. So expenditure on health increases with remittances. It is seen to reduce child mortality, reduce the effect or stabilizes effect of negative price shocks. But parental migration, if it's the parent who has migrated out, does seem to have a negative health impact on children, especially mental health impacts. And interestingly, migration seems to reduce issues of underweight children, but tend to increase overweight or obesity and other lifestyle related diseases. So this is something that has been seen in the case of some of the higher migrating states in India as well. And another negative health impact of migration is its effect on mental health and left behind members dealing with anxiety, depression, etc. Now, these okay. Now, moving on to the next aspect, which is how does it, so right now we have looked at growth, poverty, inequality, investments, both physical and human capital, and now looking at labor supply. Remittances seem to affect the choices, gives a better, bigger choice for left behind members regarding their labor market choices. So there are evidence that it has led to reduction in labor supply, in some cases only of women, in some cases both men and women, shift from formal to informal or wage employment to self-employment among women. But contradictory evidence also exists in a few places where there has been an increase in labor supply. Now, this increase in labor supply, there has been some evidence it is because of the absence of the member who migrated, along with the burden of the cost, which and in the initial times when there is absence or insufficiency of remittances, especially women who are now in charge of the household join the labor force part. And when remittance is flowing, there is this has a directly opposite impact, where there is a reduction of female labor force participation. Now, the next topic that I would like to look into is how migration affects women. What's the linkage between migration and women? So largely literature says that it affects women's autonomy, gender norms, gender relations, mostly positively, but then also if migrations are happening to more conservative societies, then there is also seems to be negative effect in terms of gender norms, gender relations, women's autonomy, etc. Looking at women migrants, female autonomy, those countries with higher levels of female autonomy seems to be the ones from where women migrate. And there is a lot of evidence that poorer women migrate out. And while in some cultures, single women has a higher tendency to migrate. In other cases, marriage increases the probability of migration. So the evidence is quite mixed. Even education and migration also have mixed results. But one result that seems to stand out, which I have not added here, is that women's remittances tend to go more towards development or investment in children and in investment in the household. This is the same when women are in charge of the household income, remittance income as well. So migration of so left behind women, wives of migrants tend to have likely more autonomy and decision making, but there is also enough evidence to state that in all cases, wives of migrants do not have control of the remittances, but other family members end up having control. But one positive effect of migration is that change gender roles, with men taking care of household chores, treating women more equally. And in some cases, this change in gender dimension even seems to be permanent. But when female migration happens, these favorable effects on gender differences seems to be more reinforced. Now, moving on to return migrants. And so how do they affect society and how do they fit back into the society? How do they reintegrate and how do they affect development? If you look at it, literature says that migration experience can create positive or upward occupational mobility, wage premium, may make it easier for you to get a job, or positively affect migrants. But then there is also evidence to show that this need not be the case always. So, for example, when I analyzed return migration in India, I found that in my study, foreign migration experience was helpful only for those who were professionally qualified. It was not helpful for the majority of people who were semi-skilled or unskilled workers. or even skilled workers, but not professionally qualified. But it can increase entrepreneurship, investments in businesses, and also enhance skill transfer. But again, the evidence is mixed. So to conclude, we can say that migration and remittances are significantly affect development, but the linkages are complex and very unique to situations. The results are very heterogeneous, and there are other factors that influence. It's not just migration and remittance in isolation. Other societal and institutional factors have a good big role to play in deciding the effect of migration and remittances on the origin region. It is important to recognize this while formulating policies to harness migration and channelize remittances for development, which is a focus of now, not only international, but also national government policies in many cases. The other important thing that we need to keep in mind is that there is a dearth of comprehensive micro-level data on migration, which makes it difficult to comprehensively study the effect of migration and remittances, and also compare countries and regions to draw meaningful inferences. This is also evidenced by the fact that when we look at literature on effect or impact of migration, we see pockets, or we see regions from which there is a lot of literature, or countries from which there are a lot of literature coming out, whereas some other countries which are also highly dependent on migration or highly remittance dependent, but not much work coming out on them, mainly because there's no data to work on, except like by doing your own simple, smaller sample surveys. So with that, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Truss and Dr. Abram, for those very interesting and insightful presentations. We'll now move on to questions. And there have been concerns about families being left behind and childcare for children left behind. In this context, we received 3 questions from the International Federation for Family Development. I'll read one question and give you a chance to respond. In the interest of time, if you can keep your responses to please less than 2 minutes so that we get through all the questions that we received. The first one is, how can social policies tackle the lack of parental care in migration situations? Anyone can start. You have 2 minutes to. How can social policies tackle the lack of parental care in migration situations?
This is a very complicated question because I think it depends, as Anu just said, these are very heterogeneous situations. It's difficult to generalize. And I'm assuming they're talking about children left behind and the parents migrate. I'm guessing that that's what this question is about. What the research shows is that in general, extended family end up taking care of the children. So not necessarily, for example, if a woman migrates, it might be her spouse or partner, but not necessarily. A lot of times it's a sister or a grandmother. So one type of social protection, of course, has to do with cash transfers, making sure that the household is stable, economically stable. That's one way. The second is with work flexibility, so that whoever is working in the household, so that they have flexibility to be able to tend to the children. Also, I was just reading an article about visas and how so many countries are reducing their numbers, particularly of longer stay visas. And that's actually very, very problematic for parenting situations, where a parent might go get a job and then want to bring their children, not necessarily for the rest of their lives, but just let's say they're on a labor contract for 2 years and they'd like their children to come, and they cannot, because as I said in my presentation, countries are really cracking down on, they're limiting migration And particularly for people who are not in high-level professional jobs, it is increasingly difficult. They may go and they may be able to work, but they even have trouble going home and visiting. And so this is very, very problematic.
Okay, thank you very much. Anu, do you have any input there? You're muted.
Yeah, I would like to agree with what Professor Bahira just said, because some work that I have done also shows that if your children are left behind with extended family, then the remittances also is significantly higher from these migrants. So I had done a little bit of study on patterns of remittances. So perhaps that becomes a kind of social contract, that you take care of my children, I remit money. But social protection policies at institutional level, I'm not sure I have an answer for that. Yeah.
Okay, no problem. The second one is closely related to that. You might have covered it. We said, how can parenting support be secured by other members of the family due to my parents migrating?
I think that was covered in the previous answer.
Yeah, I think
Okay,
so
yeah,
also.
yeah,
So because it's
I thought
usually
so
the
as well. Yeah.
family. I also wanted to add something though, because we haven't talked about gender a lot, and gender plays a very big role in this. So for example, there are a lot of recent studies now on transnational mothering. This is something very complex where the woman goes off, she leaves her children, and in the host society and in the home society, she is made out to be not a good mother because she's not with her children. In general, men do not face that same kind of prejudice when they go off and migrate and send money home. So I think we need to remember these gender differences in parenting.
Exactly. The third and last question was, what social protection strategies should be put in place to prevent abuse, extortion, exploitation, due to lack of protective family network? And this is in the context of children. I think we often assume that the family is a protective network, not always. So what social protection policies can be put in place to prevent abuse, extortion, and exploitation?
Again, I think it depends if we're talking about refugees. That's, for example, in refugee camps, that's where there are so many problems around the exploitation of children, sexual violence, all of that. Migration situations really differ. And I would say that, refugee situations aside, schools can play a very big role in the protection of children in terms of having before and after care, social workers, healthcare workers involved. And there are examples from around the world where schools have taken on a larger protective role. But I want to stress what I said in my presentation. This should not all just fall on individuals and families. There is state responsibility involved in terms of having systems in place that protect children and family members in general.
Okay. Thank you. We also have a question from Consortium of Institutions of Family Limited in Asia, CIFA. And the question is, how can we maintain close relationships within families, for example, between spouses? And to what extent can technology help? And I assume this is migrant families. How can we keep relationships within those migrant families?
I go back to my answer about the visas. Being able to visit each other is a very important, being able to have that regular, not just over FaceTime and WhatsApp chats and all that, but being able to see your spouse, being able to bring your children, that makes a very big difference in terms of family relationships. It's one thing if somebody's gone for 1 or 2 years. It's another thing if they're gone for 10 years. And that, again, there are studies on that. That has a huge influence on family relationships. If a child cannot see its mother or father for 10 years, there's often a lot of resentment that ends up building up. We tend to look very short term, that the remittances help with the educational investments and all that. But there's an emotional piece that is lost. Of course, having technology has made things better. When I'm going to date myself, I'm older than the rest of you. When I was growing up, you wrote letters, you know, and you had to wait. I remember my parents were living in another country and I would have to wait for 10, 12 days for a letter from them to come. And then I would have to write, you know, it was very laborious and phone calls were extremely expensive. Now, of course, it's so much easier. You can look at us, we're having this meeting from around the world, you know. So in that way, our world has improved.
Yeah, thank you. Anu, do you have any input?
I would just like to add to this because so in my research as well as around me, I have seen families where like before, like fathers who are migrants in the Gulf would not be able to see their children back home in India for 1 or 2 years, and they'll first see the child, and the child's reaction is that of fear. But it has actually changed, especially in the recent COVID times when families were not able to meet for 2 years. Even now, there are families which hasn't been able to meet over 3 years, etc. But the improvement in technology has actually helped bridge this gap to a large extent, especially the video calling technology. We're actually able to see, not just hear the person. I think that has been a positive effect. Not that it can replace physical presence, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And we have a question from the focal point on the family. As noted by the panelists, remittances have grown steadily, especially compared to ODA and FDI. Can we rely on predictable growth in remittances in view of growing restrictive migration policies? Your views on that?
Social scientists are notoriously bad at predicting the future. So, as I said in my presentation, it has come as a surprise the extent to which remittances grew during the crisis. I think it all depends on what happens with the global economic situation. So if the economic situation gets better and migrants are able to work, then the remittances will keep growing. But if that's not the case, I think remittances could go down. People the average, I think, what was I reading? The average amount of money, and we're just talking broad average, that is sent per month is $200. This is not a lot of money, but to the person who is sending it, if they're working, for example, here in the United States on minimum wage, that is a big chunk of their income. And to what extent are they really going to be able to sustain that over the longer term? That's anyone's guess.
Okay. And there's also another question from the focal point on the family. Do you see migration as helping to solve some demographic challenges faced especially by high-income countries?
Absolutely, yes. So I was just yesterday reading a study about Germany. The fertility rate in Germany is very low. And because during COVID-19, migration basically stopped, it's had a huge impact on by Germany opening its borders, as controversial as that was, it helped with this issue of fertility decline. But through COVID-19, with the borders closed, it has had a major impact. We need in the high income countries, including in the United States, we need people to migrate. So in order to keep the economy going, and migrants tend to have more children also. So on multiple levels, we need migration.
Okay. And Anu, do you have any?
So regarding this particular point, that I would like to add to what Bahira had said, like if you look at the average age of people, of populations in the developed countries, we see that they are all on the higher side. Perhaps so, and the average age of the working age population also is high. But then, so there, and on the other hand, most of the migrant sending countries have younger populations, so they have the demographic dividend, but also they don't have enough employment opportunities. So it could be a win-win situations to have to facilitate regular migration. I would stress on the aspect of regular migration, because also there I would like to add the point that when we are having restrictive migration policies, people still want to move because they are in the lookout for a better opportunity. So then you are actually putting them at risk. So it would be beneficial for origin countries and receiving countries and migrants and their families if we can have regular migration pathways, reduce remittance cost, as Bahira was pointing out. The remittances that people send are like very small amounts, but it is a big deal for the household that receives it, which might have like a good number of people being dependent on just that remittance. Like just to add on to that, I was recently doing a survey of migrants who had lost their jobs due to the pandemic, and it was like households with 10 members, 12 members, I'm talking about extended families, were dependent on this sole remittance income, which is what stopped when these people lost jobs. So we understand the significance of the origin countries as well. But of course, in the demographic sense, the destination countries also benefit from migration. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We have 4 questions from the New York NGO Committee on the Family, but I think the 2 presentations covered them. But I'm just going to read the questions, then give you, just in case you want to emphasize something as a wrap up, and then 1 minute each just to respond to that as a closing remark. The first question was, what are the impacts of current migration trends on families worldwide? The second one was, what is the contribution of migration and migrants to the achievement of sustainable development goals? The third one was, to what extent do international migration contribute to poverty reduction? And finally, what is the role of remittances in poverty reduction? And I think we've covered that, but maybe you can just wrap up your take home message probably from your thing in 1 minute each. Maybe what is the contribution of migration to the achievement of SDGs?
I would say that it is still a work in progress. As the SDGs point out, the different aspects of the SDGs that deals with migration and remittances, as was seen in the presentations as well. There is a lot of trust which acknowledges the importance that migration has in achieving development, especially specific targets under the SDGs. But again, institutional and policy frameworks that aid migration and the positive impacts of migration, as well as mitigate the negative impacts, would be necessary, I think, for us to realistically achieve these goals by 2030 in a sustainable manner.
Thank you, Anu.
I think, as I said in my presentation, we need to open up pathways to migration for people who are from low and middle income countries who want to migrate. They may have the will and the agency to do it, but the structures don't allow it. And so we need to open up those opportunities in the way that they used to be more open. Not everybody wants to migrate. And as you saw in my presentation, it's actually a very small proportion of people who are migrating, but providing people the opportunity to realize their capabilities, I think is a very important part in terms of realizing the SDGs.
Thank you very much, Fahira. This event entitled Families and Migration has focused on recent migration trends and the impact of families, in particular the role of remittances in poverty reduction. In months to come, we will focus on families and urbanization, which will be the theme of the 2022 International Day of Families. You are cordially invited to that event to take place in May. Thank you very much for attending this side event of the Commission for Social Development. And thank you very much to our speakers today. This concludes this event.
Thank you. Nice to meet all of you. Good to see you, Zita.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.